Hi folks, John Dunn here, RPG freelancer, publisher behind Meliorvia. I'm up here at Immortals with Mikey.
What's up, John? Man, I got a big stench of cologne or perfume behind you, but I mean, we could just carry on, keep going.
All right, so tonight we're going to talk about Blue Rose. That might be the aromatic you're thinking of.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Is that what the scent is called? Or?
So Blue Rose is a RPG setting that came out, I think, around 2005 or so originally.
What a time to be alive.
It was published and is still published by Green Ronin. And when they first introduced it was pretty much during the height of the 3.5 D&D era, when everybody was doing different things with the D20 system. And they introduced a new variant of the D20 system with this game that they called the True 20 system. The guy behind that was Steve Kenson. If you recognize that name, he's also a guy who created Mutants and Masterminds and the Icons system. Both of those are for superheroes. Blue Rose is very different. It's what they call a romantic fantasy setting. That mean anything to you, Mikey?
Romantic fantasy kind of reminds me of like Romeo and Juliet. That's the only thing I could think of. I know I'm totally off, aren't I?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's certainly one of the iconic romances, but that's not really fantasy. That's more historical.
This might be the first romantic fantasy RPG we've went over.
Oh, it is absolutely the first we've talked about, and it is really the definitive romantic fantasy setting.
Well, so please, I must listen.
One of the authors that I think of as being iconic for romantic fantasy is Mercedes Lackey, where she has written many different fantasy novels where interactions between two of the characters as they develop their relationship become a big part of it. But another element in romantic fantasy is often talking animals.
I think the frog. Can we just talk about the frog?
I mean, fair. But that's kind of an iconic element in that animals and getting back to nature can have a big part of it. So in developing this game, that was one of the things they wanted to get into. They also wanted to get into elements of inclusivity and diversity, another big component that comes a lot in romantic fantasy. Gender equality and racial equality and gender identity are all big issues that come up in that. That became a big part of Blue Rose and in the world of Aldea, which is where this campaign is set. So this iteration of it is written for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Like I said, they originally released it for True 20. They did a revision of it using the Fantasy Age system, which is still available. And actually, we don't have the Fantasy Age version on the shelf here at Immortals, but we do have an adventure for the Fantasy Age version, Envoys at the Mount. We might talk about that in a future conversation. This is a 176-page book. It is all full color, and the first 100 or so pages of it are all background material on that campaign setting. Very little game mechanics in that first chunk of the book. Instead, they present all the different nations of the world. So Aldis, Jarzoni, Rizea, Kern, Lartia, and the Borderlands are all different places, and they have very different cultures, different climates, different cities, different organizations that play a big part in the world. There's also some great full-color maps in the book to kind of tell you where those places are proportionately to one another, how big they are in terms of landmass, how far apart they are. It's well set up, and each of these different nations are distinctive and different, and it does a great job bringing the world to life. Previously, they had published quite a few different books, and this kind of condenses a lot of that information so that if you're playing D&D 5th edition, you can conveniently have a lot of that information at your fingertips. It may not pull everything from every book they published, but it gives you what you need to launch a campaign. In that first chunk, there's almost no game mechanics, but it does touch on magic and theology that are very distinctive from what you typically see in a D&D setting. The one rule it does talk about is corruption and shadow, which there are parts of the world that have been tainted by darkness and evil, and that's part of the way this game world was created. And people who interact with that or embrace it or are contaminated by that can become corrupt and turn over to shadow. And I think it's really kind of neat because the way your PC makes their choices, they can eventually become so corrupted that they become an undead entity. And depending upon that level of corruption, that could be like a ghoul or it could be a vampire. And then as part of your character's story arc, they might be able to redeem themselves by making good choices and helpful choices and turning away from that darkness. I think that makes for a really neat storyline that is kind of iconic and really fitting in with that romantic fantasy genre.
Vampire romance redemption stories. I'm here for it.
Absolutely. Spot on. It's not until we really hit chapter 8 that we get into game mechanics, and that's where we introduce ancestries or the different species that are playable in Blue Rose. The first one is humans, right? Real straightforward. The next one are night people. They were created by the Shadow Lords. They're pretty much a synthetic race. Initially, people thought they were evil, but they don't have to be inherently evil, and they look an awful lot like orcs. So they're really kind of Blue Rose's iteration on orcs. Then you've got the Rhydan, Rhydan. I may be butchering that pronunciation, but these are sapient animals. They're psychically awakened. They can talk to people psychically, and they are absolutely playable as characters. The examples that they give are cats, dolphins, horses, and wolves, but it also notes that anything with a challenge rating of a quarter or less can be used for one of those, and it's very playable. After that, it talks about sea folk, which are basically an aquatic civilization. They're not water breathers, but they can hold their breath for around 20 minutes or so, and they can swim about as fast as they can walk, but they do need to spend a lot of time around water or they're prone to dehydration. And the last one are Vada, and Vada are kind of their take on elves. They've interbred with humans, so humans can sometimes have Vada offspring. There's light Vada and shadow Vada, which are pale white and pitch black skin tones. And they're naturally kind of magical in a way that fits very specifically into Blue Rose's magic system. After that, Chapter 9 covers the different classes of D&D, and it's really just your 12 iconic D&D core classes as adapted to this setting. Chapter 10 talks about backgrounds. You've got all of your standard D&D backgrounds and then 3 that are specific to the setting. And they also introduce an alternative equipment system so that you can kind of compartmentalize and not have to do as much legwork for making choices. Instead, you have most of the gear your character is going to need or be able to use based on their background and their skills. Chapter 11 discusses magic, specific spells and types of magic as they pertain to the setting, and then it spends a fair bit of time introducing magic items, both traditional ones and then also shadow corrupted ones that are very specific to the setting and how they interact with things. And then Chapter 12 introduces creatures. It talks about your standard D&D creatures and tweaks them so that, again, they fit into the Blue Rose setting, and introduces some new ones. It talks about clockwork, fiends, fae, Rydans, and shadow touched. Again, those are templates as well that you can apply to existing D&D monsters to make them fit better into Blue Rose. The last thing in the book is an intro adventure. If you've got a group of players that want to get into a setting where they're really getting into social aspects and political aspects and playing iconic kinds of heroes who are going to develop relationships with the world around them, Blue Rose is a fantastic setting for that.
Beautifully said. I like the realism too. I think it's definitely something that people can get into.
All right. We do have a couple of copies of this here on the shelf at Immortals Inc., so stop in or hit the website.
How much is it?
Oh, it is $40, and like I said, it's about 176 pages, all of full color.
Oh, here at Immortals Inc. Only, come on. Not only, but, preferably.
Thanks for taking the time to watch, and until next time, good gaming.
Later, guys.